A phone call woke Elizabeth up in the middle of the night. Her brother, Aaron, was in the hospital in the small town they had traveled to together as children. He was fighting an illness that was progressing rapidly. Doctors had almost given up hope, but Elizabeth couldn't leave her brother to his fate. Now, having packed a few things in her traveling bag, she set off. The morning sun was just beginning to rise when she arrived at the hospital. Aaron looked exhausted. His eyes were sunken and his skin was almost transparent. She sat down by his bedside, and he smiled weakly. "I knew you would come," he whispered. "I didn't want you to worry. But I heard about someone who can help." Elizabeth leaned closer, trying to understand what he was saying. "This man, they call him the Hand of Grace. They say he can heal even when the doctors can't do anything." After talking to the doctor, who shrugged his shoulders when asked about the healer, Elizabeth went to a local cafe. There she heard more about the mysterious man. One of the waitresses said, "He lives at the edge of the forest, in an old hut. People say he works miracles, but there's always a but." Elizabeth thanked her and returned to the hospital. She didn't believe in such things, but Aaron's condition was so bad that she decided to find this Gabriel, no matter how strange the idea seemed. The hut stood in the middle of a dense forest. It looked abandoned, but cozy at the same time, as if it existed outside of time. The windows were dimly lit in the twilight, and Elizabeth felt a slight chill as she approached the door. She knocked, and the door opened almost immediately. A middle-aged man stood before her with a friendly but watchful gaze. "You came for a reason," he said without greeting. Elizabeth hesitated, but gathered her courage. "My brother, he is very sick. I was told you could help." Gabriel looked at her carefully, as if trying to read her mind. "I help those who really need it, but you should know that every healing comes at a price." Elizabeth felt her heart clench. She didn't ask about the price, not because she didn't want to know, but because she was afraid of the answer. She simply nodded in agreement. "Then bring him here tomorrow night. We'll see if there's still hope," Gabriel said, closing the door and adding, "And think about whether you are prepared for the consequences." Elizabeth returned to the hospital with a heavy heart. She felt like she was interfering in something she didn't understand, but she had no choice. She would do anything to save Aaron, even if she had to face the unknown. The next evening, Elizabeth arrived at the cabin with Aaron. The road through the forest seemed even darker than she remembered, and the silence was almost oppressive. Only the light from Gabriel's cabin broke through the dense trees, serving as a beacon in this gloomy area. Gabriel met them at the door. He looked at Aaron, and his eyes flashed for a moment with curiosity or perhaps anxiety. "Come inside," he said, gesturing for them to enter. The hut inside was warm, but at the same time had a strange atmosphere. There were ancient paintings and strange symbols on the walls, and a table with lit candles in the corner, casting a soft light around the room. Elizabeth felt her throat go dry, but she kept her composure for her brother's sake. Gabriel sat down across from Aaron and put his hand on his forehead. The healer's eyes closed, and the air in the room became heavy. After a few minutes, he pulled back and looked at Elizabeth. "His condition is serious, but not hopeless. We can try the right, but remember, what we are doing here upsets the natural balance. The price will be paid." Elizabeth looked at her brother. His face was pale, but there was a faint hope in his eyes. She nodded. "Do whatever it takes." Gabriel began to prepare. He laid out several items on the table: a bowl, a knife with a carved handle, and a small amulet with an incomprehensible symbol. Elizabeth kept her eyes on the process, but she felt her heart clench with fear. Something in the air was changing, as if nature itself was retreating before what was about to happen. Gabriel directed Elizabeth to take a seat next to Aaron and hold his hand. He began to whisper words that sounded like an ancient prayer. The candlelight flickered, and the room was filled with shadows that moved on their own. When the ritual reached its climax, Gabriel took a knife and made a small cut in his palm. Drops of blood fell into the chalice, and at the same moment Aaron shuddered. His body tensed for a moment and then relaxed. His breathing became steadier and his face less exhausted. "Is that it?" Elizabeth whispered, not believing her eyes. Gabriel nodded, but his face remained serious. "The rite is complete, but now something else begins. You must be prepared for the consequences." Back at the hospital, Elizabeth and Aaron were amazed. His tests showed a remarkable improvement. The doctors could not explain how this happened. They called it a medical miracle, but Elizabeth knew it was the right. However, her joy did not last long. The next night, Elizabeth woke up to a strange noise. It was a whispering sound that seemed to come from everywhere. She got out of bed and saw that her room door was slightly ajar. There was no one in the hallway, but a cold draft made her skin tingle. When she returned to her room, she saw something moving in the mirror. It was a shadow, but it didn't belong to her. Elizabeth realized that this was only the beginning of what Gabriel had warned her about. As the days passed, Aaron's condition continued to improve. Elizabeth looked at her brother with hope, but her heart was weighed down by a sense of anxiety. The whisper she had heard that night never happened again, but the shadow in the mirror remained in her memory. Something was wrong, and she knew it. One evening, while they were eating dinner at home, Aaron suddenly fell silent. His gaze became blank, and his hand with the cutlery hung in the air. "Aaron? What's wrong?" asked Elizabeth, leaning closer. He suddenly snapped out of it and grabbed her hand. "He's here," he whispered. "I see him in my dreams." "Who?" she asked cautiously. Aaron shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but every night he stands at the end of the room, looking at me. I can feel his anger." Elizabeth decided to go to Gabriel's again. She could not ignore what was happening. His hut looked the same, but this time it seemed to her that the forest around him had become even darker. She knocked on the door, and Gabriel appeared almost immediately. "I warned you of the consequences," he said, not even asking why she was here. "What is happening to my brother?" asked Elizabeth. Her voice trembled. Gabriel gestured for her to sit down. "The rite of healing is always an exchange. To save one, you have to give something else. In this case, the shadow came to balance the imbalance." Elizabeth felt a coldness envelop her. "How do you stop it?" "It depends on what you're willing to sacrifice," Gabriel said, his voice calm but tinged with compassion. "The shadow is an echo of anger that has been left unfinished. We need to find its source and put it to rest. But be prepared. The price may be higher than you expect." Elizabeth returned home with a new plan. She decided to research Gabriel and the rites past to figure out how to finish what had begun. She started at the library, where she found old archives about local history. One of the documents told about an ancient ritual that was performed on the land and about the spirits that were attached to those who disturbed the order of nature. The documents mentioned a place called the Top of the Shadows, an old hill in the forest where rituals were performed to lock up spirits who had gone beyond. Elizabeth realized that this place could be the key to saving Aaron. She brought her brother to the forest at night. Aaron was weak and scared, but agreed to go with her. They found the Peak of Shadows, and everything there seemed frozen in time. Trees surrounded a small stone altar, and the moonlight shone through the branches, illuminating the place. Elizabeth began to read the words from the text she had found in the archive. The air grew heavier, and the shadows around them began to move. One of them grew, taking the shape of a man with empty eyes. "You've upset the balance," said a voice coming from everywhere. Elizabeth raised her hands. "I want to end this. Take me, but leave my brother." The shadow came closer, and Aaron tried to hold Elizabeth. "No, I will not allow this. It's the only way," she said, looking him in the eye. A shadow enveloped Elizabeth, and for a moment everything went dark. But then the light returned, and Aaron fell to his knees, feeling calm again. The shadows disappeared, and the top of the shadows became quiet. The shadows absorbed the light, leaving only the faint flicker of the moon on the stone altar. Elizabeth stood still, feeling the air around her grow heavier. Aaron, exhausted and frightened, sank to his knees. His breathing was raspy, but he kept his eyes on his sister. The shadow that grew out of the darkness was gigantic, its shape changing as if it were alive. It did not need words to convey its anger and demand. Elizabeth felt a coldness penetrate her soul, as if it were her last breath before jumping into the abyss. She picked up the old amulet she had found in the altar and placed it on the stone. The shadows froze, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Elizabeth closed her eyes and began to read the words carved into the stone. Her voice trembled, but the words sounded clear, breaking through the thick darkness. The shadows swirled in a chaotic dance around her, their movement accelerating and the air filling with a strange humming. Elizabeth felt her body weaken, but she continued the ritual. A faint light was lit on the altar, growing brighter by the minute. The stone began to pulse with warmth, as if it were alive. Suddenly, everything stopped. Silence fell, and only a faint wind disturbed it. The shadows dissolved into the night air, and the light from the altar went out. Elizabeth fell to her knees, feeling her strength leaving her. She looked up and saw Aaron standing in front of her, his face full of life again. The forest around her had changed. It no longer seemed oppressive, and the moonlight flooded the pinnacle of shadows. Aaron helped Elizabeth up, and they slowly left the place that had witnessed their struggle. When Elizabeth returned home, she felt that something was different. Her body was weak, and in the mirror she noticed a subtle shadow behind her reflection. She knew that shadows don't disappear forever. They just bide their time. But she also knew that she had made the right choice. The next morning, Aaron woke up completely healthy, and Elizabeth sat next to him, looking out at the sunlight flooding the room. She felt that even though her sacrifice had left a mark, she had been able to save what was most precious to her. But deep down, she knew that the balance of nature would always take its course. A week later, the town returned to its normal rhythm. Aaron went about his business again, full of the energy he had long since lost. Elizabeth was trying to get back to normal, but something in her changed. The feeling of a shadow that had stayed with her after the ritual did not disappear. One morning, when the sun was breaking through the curtains of her room, Elizabeth got up and went to the mirror. The reflection looked ordinary, but she felt that someone was watching her. In the depths of the mirror, shadows moved, barely noticeable. They were quiet, unobtrusive, but still there. She lowered her head and felt a coldness touch her fingers. It was like a light breeze, a reminder of that night. She knew that the shadows had not completely disappeared. They may no longer pose a threat, but they will remain close by, reminding her of the imbalance. On her way home that evening, Elizabeth noticed something strange. At the crossroads where the main road and the old path met, she saw a stranger. He was standing with his back to her, but his posture was motionless, and the shadow under his feet looked too long for twilight. Elizabeth stopped, her heart beating faster. The stranger turned his head slowly, and for a moment she thought his face was blank, without features. When she blinked, the figure disappeared, leaving only a gentle breeze and the rustling of leaves. At home, she opened the window, peering out into the darkness. Everything was quiet, but she knew that her journey with the shadows was not over. Their presence was now a part of her life, a memory of what she had done. Elizabeth sat down at her desk and opened her notebook. She began to write down everything she had experienced. It was her attempt to leave a mark, to explain what had happened, even if no one would ever read it. The words on the paper were heavy, but at the same time they freed her. On the last page she wrote, "Shadows don't disappear, they just change. But even in the darkness, you can find light." When she finished, the candle on the table flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Elizabeth smiled. She was no longer afraid. She knew she had made the right choice, even if her life would never be the same.